On this episode of Create, Consume, Repeat, I take a stroll down memory lane and play Resident Evil, a game so groundbreaking, it makes me want to throw my fucking controller against the wall every single time I play it. And if that sounds confusing, well, let me explain. Released in 1996 by Capcom on the original PlayStation, Resident Evil would go on to sell millions of copies, spawn countless sequels, launch a franchise that includes comic books, scented candles, several feature films, which are all f***ing horrendous, and of course, be considered a video game classic. But at the risk of being downvoted into oblivion and being labeled a contrarian, I decided to go back and objectively look at Resident Evil, a game that would not only define a genre, but lay the groundwork for many of the game mechanics we now take for granted. Now, before I jump in, it's important to note that I won't be playing the original PlayStation release, since that would introduce issues like graphic fidelity, an antiquated control scheme, terrible writing, corny full motion video, and minor soundtrack differences, all of which would skew my objective opinion. And if I'm being 100% honest, having to play Resident Evil with the original control scheme, well, that would make this the shortest video ever, since tank controls suck balls and make enjoying this game in 2020 nearly impossible. No amount of nostalgia will ever convince me otherwise. So instead of playing the original, I've opted to play the Resident Evil Remaster, which offers updated graphics, the ability to switch between classic and a modern, user-friendly control scheme, updates to the original cheesy script, and replaces the corny full-motion video with new 3D rendered cutscenes that are pretty awesome. And for you purists out there, don't think of this like me watching the updated Star Wars trilogy Lucas put out. Instead, look at it like me playing the Francis Ford Coppola Apocalypse Now director's cut. That doesn't f*** with perfection. It only improves the horror. The fixed camera angle is arguably the most iconic characteristic of Resident Evil, but it was a design choice born out of hardware limitations, maximizing visual fidelity, and granting the developer more control over the player, since the fixed camera angle creates a feeling of claustrophobia, prevents the player from seeing things around the corner, allows developers the ability to carefully and meticulously script traps and action sequences, and ultimately gives the game its unique cinematic look. Add the now outdated tank controls to the mix, and you have the perfect recipe for fear, anxiety, and frustration, since players not only have to have laser fast reflexes, they now also need to be mentally nimble enough to overcome the disorientation from the constantly switching camera, blind spot zombie attacks, and unforgiving control scheme. It should be noted that while the topic of game controls is polarizing amongst fans, the team resorted to this option only because the original PlayStation had yet to introduce the analog controller that we now take for granted, which is why the remaster offers the option to use a modern control scheme, which allows a new generation of gamers the chance to experience the game, as well as offer old gamers that got so frustrated by the original the opportunity to finally vindicate themselves. And while we're on the topic of frustration, let's examine the save system, a system that effectively increases the difficulty and tension of the game by allowing you to only save a limited amount of times in fixed locations and requires the player to locate hidden ink ribbons throughout the mansion. Obviously, some of these mechanics seem archaic in the modern world of autosaves, but I argue this delicate balance of the risk-reward save system actually made Resident Evil super addictive. Do you push deeper into the mansion without saving and risk being killed, only to have to fight a boss battle all over again, or resolve a really difficult puzzle, or methodically retrace one steps through a mansion that serves as one giant 3D puzzle box, like in Hellraiser, my favorite? And since we're talking about puzzles, well, let's be honest. Resident Evil is reminiscent of Seventh Guest or Myst, which also hindered progression until you solved a puzzle or found a missing piece. Yet here again though, Resident Evil proves frustrating since the puzzles are unbalanced, with difficulty ranging from comically simple to completely impossible to solve, since they make absolutely no sense, none whatsoever, and offer no valuable clues to help you solve them, forcing players to resort to trial and error. And let's be honest, that isn't fun for anybody. I mean, yeah, you can go to a wiki page or, game facts, but that noise. Further complicating matters is the inventory system that becomes a game within a game. Players are forced to carefully decide what's essential, because often enough you will encounter items that you need to leave behind because you have no way of dropping items unless you're near a save point. But here again, we see a game mechanic that at first blush seems unnecessarily frustrating. But when placed alongside the other game mechanics discussed earlier, well, we can kind of see the brilliance in this design choice. See, a limited inventory forces players to make hard choices regarding what to take and leave behind. If you load up on too many items, you may encounter an important puzzle piece or time-sensitive item you can't pick up, which in turn forces you to make a mental map and scramble to beat the clock, since failing to do so can dramatically alter the game's outcome, which may force you to roll back to an old save, or if you're really careless, have to start from the very, very beginning. Which, coincidentally enough, is the moment most gamers throw their controller across the room in sheer frustration. Just like a toxic relationship that is pure bliss 1 minute and shit show the next, Resident Evil will drive you mad, because at its core, the game is a brilliant masterpiece that tests your intelligence, raises your anxiety levels, and jolts you with perfectly timed scares. But its rough edges and ambition can at times prove too much for certain players, which is to be expected since Resident Evil is like a Tarantino film. Just go with me for a second. It's an amalgam of inspiration remixed into something we've never experienced before, which in this case is survival horror. Thankfully, later games in the franchise and games by other developers would smooth out these rough edges and refine the mechanics. Stellar examples of games that took the Resident Evil template and improved upon it are Silent Hill, Fatal Frame, Dead Space, my all-time favorite, and Evil Within, to name a few. That just about wraps it up for this episode, and I'd love to hear your thoughts and comments in the section below. And don't forget to hit the like, subscribe, and bell buttons below as well. It helps me grow the channel and alerts you when I drop a new episode. Catch you guys next time. Oh, and sorry about the delay on this episode. The world's a really dark place right now, and sometimes it's really hard to get inspired to make these videos.